Today, we will hear from two presenters. Lindsey Witt-Swanson is the Research Director in the Public Affairs and Media Research Department at NORC, located at the University of Chicago. Daniel Cox serves as the Director of the Survey Center on American Life and a Senior Fellow in Polling and Public Opinion at the American Enterprise Institute. Together, they are the lead authors of the recently released report, Faith After the Pandemic: How COVID-19 Changed American Religion. Let's get started. Welcome, Lindsey. We look forward to your presentation.
Like I said, thank you so much for having us. We'll just go ahead and jump right in. So Dan's organization, the American Enterprise Institute, contracted with my organization, NORC, to conduct the 2022 American Religious Benchmark Survey. And the survey utilized the AmeriSpeak panel. It's NORC's probability-based panel that's designed to be representative of the United States household population. And panelists are able to complete a survey either online or over the phone, their choice. The study that we're going to present collected data at two different time points. So first, before the pandemic, and we're considering anything between 2018 to March 2020 as before the pandemic. And then we surveyed the same people again in the spring of 2022 as part of the 2022 American Religious Benchmark Survey. And what's really powerful about this study is that in addition to being able to compare aggregate results from one time point to aggregate results at another time point, we're also able to look at differences at the individual level. So we're able to compare Lindsey before the pandemic to Lindsey in spring 2022. And we're able to do this for over 9,000 people. We're going to focus on two survey questions. First, asking people what their religious affiliation was at the time that they were completing the survey, and then also asking them about the frequency of their religious attendance. And we gave them all sorts of different answer options to tell us how often they were attending religious services at that time. But for the simplicity of our analyses, we recoded those into four different categories. So if they said they never attended, they never attended. That one's pretty easy. If they said they attended less than once per year, about once or twice a year, or several times a year, we said that they infrequently attended. If they said that they attended about once a month or 2 to 3 times a month, we considered that occasional attendance. And if they reported that they attended nearly every week or several times a week, we considered that regular attendance. So with that background, it's time for another breakout. During this breakout, we would love if you could consider discussing this question. In your experience, you guys' lovely faces are in my way. In your experience, where have you seen changes in American religious life as a result of the pandemic? Now we'll get back. I hope you guys had a great conversation. We will just jump into the findings. So the first finding is that religious affiliation really didn't change over the course of the pandemic. Here we have the 8 most common religious affiliations in our study, and for each one we have 2 bars. The green bar is the percentage of people who reported that religious affiliation before the pandemic, and then the blue bar is the percentage that reported that religious affiliation in the spring of 2022. And as you can see, most of those bars are really the same. Even the ones that are a little different are only about 1 percentage point different. So really overall, religious affiliation remained largely unchanged over the course of the pandemic. What did change, this probably won't be a surprise, it just came up in my breakout group, is that frequency of religious service attendance did decrease. And here we see that a quarter of US adults reported never attending religious services before the pandemic, and a third in the spring of 2022. So moving from 1 in 4 people to 1 in 3 people. At the same time, the people who were going regularly, they were tried and true. About a quarter of US adults reported attending regularly, both pre-pandemic and in the spring of 2022. So where we're really seeing the movement is in these inner 2 groups, most notably infrequently, people just moving from infrequently to never, causing that increase. When we look at changes by various groups, we see again that the percentage of people who reported never attending increased for really all these groups, although some of them might not be significantly different. So the green dot you see is the percentage of people in that group that reported never attending religious services. And the blue dot is the percentage of people who reported never attending religious services in the spring of 2022. And we can see, like I said, an increase in the percentage of people who said never attended in the spring of 2022 compared to the pandemic. The most notable difference are among people who reported or considered themselves to be liberal, never married, and young adults. Here we see about a third of them, each group, reporting never attending in the pre-pandemic, and then almost half of them reporting the same in the spring of 2022. What we also see is there is a group of people that are always more likely to attend, and it's these folks down here. Women, people with a college degree or more, married, adults 50 or older, and conservatives were more likely to attend religious services both pre-pandemic and in the spring of 2022. When we look at religious attendance over time by religious affiliation, here we see that increase in the never category. So for each of the affiliations, we have the pre-pandemic on the top, the spring 2022 on the bottom. And for these gray boxes, it's almost like a step. So for most of the affiliations, we did see an increase in the people who never are attending, with the exception of people who identify as Mormon or members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. They're up here at the top. 70 to 72% of them reported regularly attending at both time periods. So they are, the vast majority of them are attending and attending regularly, and there just really isn't a lot of movement here between the two time points in their frequency of attendance. So this chart is where we start looking at differences or changes within the same person. So here we have our 4 categories pre-pandemic, our 4 categories spring of 2022. The thicker the bar, the more people we're looking at. And you can see that the thickest bars are for people who stayed at the same frequency, regularly to regularly, infrequently to infrequently, never to never. There is occasionally to occasionally, but it's such a small group that the bar just doesn't look that big. And we see from each category that there's these offshoots, with thicker bars going to categories that are closer to it, but then thinner bars going to those further away. And we see both the decrease and the increase and really everything in between. Every category had somebody going to the other category. And so we wanted to be able to measure this change at the individual level. And I want to explain the variable that I'm gonna show you the findings of here in a little bit. And I wanted to do it here just so it's fresh in your mind when we talk about the findings. So you've been hearing me talk about regularly, occasionally, infrequently, and never. We wanted one variable that would contain both the direction of change and the magnitude of change if change existed. So we created a variable that included much less often, same, more often, and much more often. And the less, more, and the same, that's all very intuitive. But I wanted to take a moment to explain the difference between less often and much less often, and more often and much more often. So if a person went from regularly attending before the pandemic to occasionally attending, that's a 1 category change. So we would say that they're attending less often. If they went from regularly to infrequently or never, 2 category change. So we would say much less often. And then the same can be true in the other direction. So with that, these are our findings with that in measuring individual change. What we're seeing here is really what we saw in that flow chart, those big, thick bands of people staying in the same category. About 70% really where the frequency that they were attending before the pandemic is the frequency that they were attending in the spring of 2022. But we did see change. The orange are the folks who decreased their frequency of attendance, and the blue is the folks who increased their attendance. You can see orange is bigger than blue. Twice as many people decreased their attendance as increased their attendance. But we did find that 1 in 10 US adults increased their attendance either a little or a lot, and about 1 in 5 US adults decreased their attendance, again, either a little or a lot. When we look at these changes by groups, there's a few things I want to highlight. One is lots of gray. These are the people who stayed at the same consistency. A lot more orange than blue, a lot more people decreasing attendance than increasing attendance. And then we also see that younger adults, adults with less than a college degree, and Black Protestants saw the largest increase in attendance. And then younger adults again, adults with a college degree or less, Hispanic Catholics, Black Protestants, and white mainline Christians saw the largest decreases. So with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk about implications. And Dan, you can tell me if you want me to stop sharing or what you'd like me to do.
No, that's all good. So I'm not going to talk about any particular slides. I am going to just talk about some of my own work and some of the implications for what Lindsey just discussed. And one of the things that I want to point back to one of the slides that Lindsey showed in that big demographic chart where she looked at the groups that had seen the greatest increase in people who are never attending. We saw that among young adults, we're most likely to see an increase in people never attending, and seniors age 65 and older were among the least. But what happened is that we're not seeing an even shift among the American public. And I think this is one of the most important findings of this research. There's a tendency when we talk about national trends to think like, well, everyone's kind of affected by these things in the same degree or in the same way. But we know that's not the case. We know that people at the sort of fringe, people were less frequently attending before the pandemic, were the ones who are most likely to drop out. Young people, liberals, people who are not married, also much more impacted by the pandemic in terms of the frequency of worship attendance than those who are attending more regularly. And the result of this change is actually we're not seeing a sort of shift in the overall religious trajectory as an acceleration of existing trends. So for the last 10, 15 years, we've seen that young people who are politically liberal are far more likely to disaffiliate, to leave regular worship practice than those who are conservative, those who are more educated, and those who are older. And this is again, a trend that goes back at least 10, 20 years. And so what we're seeing is actually an increasing religious polarization, where there are people who remain very, very committed to their faith and their faith community on the one hand, and they didn't really shift, right? The pandemic didn't really move them, as Lindsey showed. And on the other hand, you see this group of growing folks who are just not involved at all. And they're growing because of this sort of more, these folks on the kind of margins, and that's where that increase is happening. And so we're seeing this demographically as well. So when you think about geography and generation and politics, we're becoming more polarized along religion than we have been in the past. And I'll give just a couple examples so you guys can get a handle of what I'm talking about. So over the last 7 or 8 years, looking at that state level religiosity, if you look at how often people in Mississippi attended religious services, if you look at their religious affiliation, there's really little change. So Mississippians 7, 8 years previous didn't look that different than they look today, right? Regardless of the pandemic. But if you look at a state like Vermont, the number of people who are religiously unaffiliated today is far greater than it was just a few years earlier. So the number of people in Vermont who are unaffiliated is 45%. So nearly half the state is now not religious. It was a third about 7, 8 years earlier. Among Mississippi, before the pandemic, it was like around 12%. After pandemic, it's like 14%. So it's really within the margin of error. There's, the religiosity of Mississippi has not really been all that affected. So what's happened then is the religiosity of these two states has shifted in a direction to become further apart. So we're seeing that, in terms of religiosity, and then sort of all the sort of cultural effects downstream of that as well. We're seeing that along generational lines as well. So as Lindsey showed, before the pandemic, roughly I think it was 20% of young adults and like 10% of seniors said that they never attended. That jumped to 43% among young adults after the pandemic, and 20% among seniors. So it went from a 10-point gap in terms of people never attending to a 23-point gap. So again, the religious experiences and activities of young people versus older people are moving farther apart. So that is something else we're seeing. And the last group I want to focus on is political liberals versus political conservatives, because this is something else that, for at least the last couple of decades, we're seeing liberals are disproportionately likely to disaffiliate. And our data in the pandemic are showing the same kind of thing, that the gap between liberals and conservatives is increasing as well. So we're seeing that before the pandemic, there was a gap among liberals and conservatives, but it's wider now. And in fact, in most of our polling, we're seeing roughly a 30-point gap in terms of sort of the religiosity of liberals and conservatives. So for all these reasons, right, the pandemic didn't sort of set us on a new trajectory so much as it sort of pushed us further along on a trajectory that we were already on. So that's sort of the one big takeaway, the kind of so what question for this research. The other thing that we didn't really talk about in this work, but it has a lot of implications, and I'm sure a lot of you are kind of interested in it and maybe experiencing it firsthand, is, well, what about online worship and sort of the online community building that many churches found themselves sort of forced to think about or engage in due to the pandemic and the social isolation that was brought about because of it. Well, there's a couple of things to note here. One is that, whether it's apps or people experimenting with various kinds of online platforms to engage in religious worship, they're much more popular now than previous. And I think there's something that's really positive about that development. I've talked to a number of pastors who have sort of incorporated this into their worship. It allows them to reach people that might not otherwise been able to reach, people with disabilities, people who may face geographic barriers. So I think there's an incredible positive part of all that. It's much more efficient. I think a lot of people like that as well. I mean, there's a way in which, being able to kind of tune in when you're traveling or out of town or feeling a little sick, so you can't make it to a formal worship service, but you can kind of still, kind of log in online and see it and connect that way. I think, again, there's something that is ultimately going to be beneficial for a lot of religious communities, but I think there's some downsides in the convenience that online worship offers. And first is that being part of a religious community and participating in worship isn't necessarily about convenience and efficiency, right? In fact, some of the best parts about it is that it is entirely inefficient. The community building that comes with in-person worship, I think, cannot be replicated online. And so I think that the allure of technology is that it makes things easier and more convenient, but it can prove sort of counterproductive when we're trying to connect with each other and establish a community. So I think for all those reasons, I think there's a number of ways in which the online sort of future of worship remains kind of a double-edged sword. The other thing to just note is that this sort of same sort of cultural convenience that we're seeing widespread in our society, right? So we can do drive-through coffee. There's a new Taco Bell in Minneapolis where you don't even need to talk to anyone, where the whole thing is automated. But I think that there's something really problematic about that we don't get the kind of interpersonal interactions in these kind of things, right? This efficiency, this kind of automation makes the whole thing kind of more consumerist and less, it doesn't really challenge us. It doesn't really offer us any kind of way to connect. And so I think there's, thinking about worship and religious communities in that way, I think there's something problematic about it. So I'm gonna pause there. I have lots more to say, but I want to give us time to sort of reflect and sort of have people talk back at me if they'd like. Thank you both.
So the question that we ask you to be talking about in your breakout room is how should religious leaders and congregations respond to this decline of in-person worship after the pandemic? Well, welcome back. And we're delighted to spend some time in Q&A here with Lindsey and Daniel. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm sure that some of the breakouts had some great conversation about it. If you have a question or comment, put it in the chat or use the raise hand function. And that is going to help me make sure that I don't miss anybody in this. So if I may start with a question for Lindsey and Daniel. Appreciate the conversation about implications. I want to know from your perspective, because you're closest to the data, what surprised you, if anything, about your findings?
It takes a lot to surprise me. I'm looking at data all day, and I've been doing this kind of work for over 15 years. I got my start at the Pew Research Center doing religion and politics polling. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think it was at least notable, if not surprising, is how much the pandemic really did just kind of give us a push on a direction we were already headed, and how quickly that we're seeing this amount of religious polarization opening up. Right? Again, we were moving more like this, and then it kind of jumped. Something that we don't know, right? Like our data goes out to spring 2022. It's not inconceivable that there could be a shift, right? The stuff we're seeing, and people are arguing that we're kind of, time is ripe for like a religious revival. We're seeing some of that stuff maybe in Kentucky. This is not necessarily national trends. We're seeing sort of more pockets than anything else, but I don't think it's inevitable that the course we're on will stay forever. So a lot will depend on how various people react, how we sort of think about these challenges, and how we respond to them. So I think like that to me is sort of the big unanswered question in all of this. So like we know the truth so far out to spring of 2022. We cannot see any further out than that. So I think it kind of bears watching where we're headed from now.
Thank you. There is a chat question that came through that it has to deal with demographics. So is there any reason that Asian American Christians were not included in this survey?
They were. I guess I'm trying to think through what about maybe the way that religious affiliation was broken out. Is that maybe the reason for the question, since we have Hispanic Catholics, Black Protestants? That might be the reason for it. Dan, do you want to talk about you have
Sure.
a lot of experience with how we broke out that religious question?
Yeah, so we didn't break out a group of Asian American Christians in the survey. I think we may have had limits of sample size, so it's not always possible to report out every community. We didn't report out a lot of smaller religious communities such as Muslims or Hindus as well. And that's just an artifact of the size of the sample, right? So we don't have large enough samples that we have sort of reasonable, sort of, at least in sort of our world, it's like at least 150 or so cases. So that we have reasonable estimates that we can reliably report out on. So that's sort of the reason for that. Asian Americans were included in the sample. They're part of the national sample. It is nationally representative. So we can be at least sure that we're representing in the entirety of the US. But in terms of breaking out some of these smaller constituencies, and we can't say with a lot of certitude what's happening within these sort of smaller cohorts.
Thank you. I'm sure whoever asked that question, if they needed to follow up, they can put it in the chat, and we'll make sure to share that with you. Another question is, do you have any insight? This is another chat question. Do you have any insight into how polarization is distributed geographically? And you sort of began to touch on that some, Daniel. And did you find that polarization was more or less intense depending on the area?
So there's some new research that is suggesting that and this is not necessarily entirely due to the pandemic. It could be due to sort of other cultural forces and social changes that are occurring as well. But what the authors are finding is that states that were already less religious, so think, a lot of the New England states, a lot of the states in the West Coast, they're seeing a much more rapid rise in secular identity. So the states that were already less religious are becoming much more so more rapidly than others. My own work has looked at the relationship between religious diversity and religious commitment and finds that they're negatively correlated. So in a state like Mississippi, which is about half the state is Baptist, they tend to have very high levels of religiosity, almost however you measure it. But when you look at a state like Vermont, which is actually, despite being racially rather homogeneous, there's a good deal of religious diversity in Vermont, at least how we measured it. And so that states like, Oregon and California, New Hampshire, New England, most of New England, they tend to have high levels of religious diversity and low levels of religious commitment. And so there's every reason to believe that those trends will continue, right? Because the religious culture is, already kind of moving in one direction, it's going to continue to do so. And the gap between our most religious and least religious states continues.
Okay, thank you. There's a sort of a follow-up statement that came through in chat about the Asian American question that says from Martin Lee, we are conducting Asian American congregation leadership practices and have 6,000 directories. So is there anything you wanted to respond to related to that statement?
I would just say that, it is both very important and can be very challenging to do reliable, and Lindsey, feel free to jump in on this, to do really reliable and representative interviewing from some of these communities. So if you're doing a community of the Asian American population, to make it representative, you really want to be interviewing in, I don't know, half a dozen different languages, to make sure that you're capturing all these, important communities. And so I think that's the challenge that a lot of pollsters like myself face. We conduct all our surveys in English and Spanish, and we know there are groups that, for whatever reason, whether there's language barriers or there's sort of cultural challenges in connecting these folks, that we know that there are these challenges, but survey costs is incredibly expensive. And so we do our best. We want to make sure that we have representative samples. We want to make sure that we're capturing all these different perspectives and communities. And we know, for instance, the Asian American religion is really different than Hispanic Americans and Black Americans and white Americans. So, it's something that we're always keeping an eye on. And we moved away at AEI from doing small surveys of 1,000 or 2,000 people. We tend to do 5,000 or more interviews, just because we know we can't reach a lot of these important communities if we don't do larger surveys. And so despite the cost, we tend to do that. It still means that we have to draw the line somewhere. But I recognize that there's more work to be done. There's more ways that we can try to figure out how to address and represent these communities that we don't see and hear about as often.
Yeah, and just to echo that, so like Dan was mentioning, when it comes to measuring, statistical differences and things like that, we do really have to draw the line at a certain point with a certain number of people, just to make sure that we have confidence in what we're saying. And even though that's fantastic, it sounds like you have a lot of people. The survey was nationally representative. So even though it feels like a lot of people, if it's maybe a smaller group of our nation picture, we might just not have enough people to be able to say anything definitively about it. And we certainly wouldn't want to guess or say anything incorrectly about a group.
Thank you. So another question is, because I know that we have a number of folks here today who are practitioners caring for clergy. And so what would be the key nugget you would hope that those practitioners for caring for clergy would take away from your findings?
So I mentioned this to my breakout group. So one of the things that is really striking to me is that there is a large number of Americans who are at more or less at the periphery, where they're attending infrequently. They may be engaging in other types of religious activities irregularly. And we you know, the question about why people are leaving, I think, misses these folks because they're still there. And I think a more important question to ask is like, why are they staying? What is it? What's keeping them involved, or you know, even if it's irregularly? And I think we don't have a good answer for that. And it's something that, you know, as a researcher, I'm continually trying to figure out what is the best way to get at this. I mean, we're trying to hit a moving target, but I think that is an incredibly important part of the story here, right? There are some kind of marginally involved folks who are remaining so, you know, and you know, we know people are falling away, but some are sticking around, and I think we don't necessarily have a good idea why, whether it's sort of familial connection, you know, they have a cultural or ethnic connection to their community, or something else. Like, and I think that's something that would be important to know.
And so how maybe that goes to another question, is that, do you see that as an outgrowth of like the next study that would come along that needs to be done? Or how would somebody who is a practitioner, would you recommend that they dig into that, into figuring out the whys? Because that's, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it may be as simple as finding folks who are there maybe just around the holidays, or, you know, not always there, but like there once in a while, or people know them. So, hey, you know, what's going on in your life? What's happening? You know, haven't seen you around. Or how do you think about religious community? What does it mean to you? What would, you know, make you come around more often? Something else that I mentioned in as part of the breakouts was, you know, the rise of mental health challenges among young people. You know, we've never seen a greater need for regular engagement in community, you know, providing meaning and belonging and purpose. There's so many people, you know, whether it's CDC reports or other research showing that the mental health challenges that young people are facing is really something we haven't seen before. And, you know, I think there's a definite role for a lot of religious communities to play in all this. And I think that, you know, it remains to be seen. Like, I'm not, you know, I'm just a survey researcher. So far be it for me to give direction to folks on the ground, but I think there is an opportunity here, I think, that we can recognize and identify. But again, the next steps, I you know, as above my pay grade.
Well, thank you. So another question is, how might we be creating community in an online setting? Any thoughts that you all have specific to the online setting and creating that sense of community?
I would say this. So this is my first experience doing these small breakout groups, and I think the size has a lot to do with it, right? So it becomes, you know, even at like, I've given tons of presentations, so like 7, 8, 9 people online, it becomes kind of a lot, right? But if you're talking about 3 and 4, it's, you know, we were in the breakout groups for like 10, 15 minutes. And I already felt, even in that short period of time, an ability to foster even kind of basic connection with folks. So I think it starts with size and having a well-articulated purpose that we know what we're here to do. We know why we're participating. And like with those two things, I think that's a pretty good place to start. I don't know if, Lindsey, if you've ever done anything like this before. This is new for me, and I actually really enjoyed the experience.
Yeah, the breakout part was very, very new to me, but I really did like it, being able to discuss things with people. And, you know, I'm also a survey researcher, you know, have a religious life, but I'm definitely not the expert in things like you guys. So it was nice to be able to present a little and then get thoughts from the audience, and present a little and get some more thoughts. So that was, I really enjoyed it.